wasn't going to post a video so soon after the draft grades won, but then I couldn't resist ruining this guy's day. But all jokes aside, the Chargers have had a long history with undrafted free agents, so it's worth taking a look and seeing who could be the next Austin Ekeler. Also, just wanted to say thanks for getting me to 1K subscribers. As one commenter suggested, I should make it a pineapple pizza. And I think that's a pretty good idea because I can turn the pineapples into little bolts. But anyways, let's get into it. One thing you'd have to say about Tom Telesco, he was pretty good with undrafted free agents. Among his finds are Austin Ekeler, Phillips, even Michael Davis, who was pretty decent for a little while. But even before that, the Chargers had a long streak of having undrafted players make the roster, which is a history that not every team has. And I don't expect that to change with the Ortiz regime, considering Ortiz came from the Ravens and just brought Gus Edwards, a former undrafted free agent. So he obviously knows how important these pickups are. Interestingly, the Chargers signed 21 players this year, compared to 18 last year and 14 the year prior. It's a more startling number when you look around the league. A team like the Eagles, for example, only has 6 this year. Their GM, Howie Roseman, decided to focus on guys off of other teams' practice squads, and even use the draft to try to acquire picks for next year. The thinking being that the end of the draft has a lot of super seniors, and next year you're going to see more underclassmen declare, so there'll be more opportunities to find some undiscovered gems next year. It doesn't appear like Ortiz or really Harper, for that matter, care about what age a guy is. I think they're sending a message by bringing in 21 guys who don't have guaranteed deals into camp. They want their draft picks and younger guys on the team surrounded with really hungry players. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these guys actually make the team. Let's start with the pass catchers. Wide receiver Jaylen Gill is a pretty interesting choice. He never amassed more than 516 yards in his career, and even that season came when he was a 6th-year senior. When you look at his measurables, he ran a 4.51 in the 40, and he's 5'11", not particularly big or particularly fast. But coming out of high school, he was a 4-star recruit according to 24/7 Sports, and he started his college career at Ohio State, which is a notorious breeding ground for wide receivers. Obviously, I have no insider information on this, but wouldn't be surprised if Harbaugh knew of him because of the Big Ten connections and decided he was worth a shot. So all in all, I'm intrigued by him despite the not great stats, and we'll see if Ortiz and Harbaugh can tap into his pedigree. Next up, we've got Jalen Johnson. Not only is he the second wide receiver named Jaylen that the Chargers picked up, he too started his career at a bigger school, moving from Georgia to ECU. He's listed a lot as 6'2", but according to the Beast Guide, he's closer to 6'1", and perhaps even a shade under. At 200 pounds, that's I guess decent size, but nothing special. But he also didn't run a particularly fast 40, and his arm length being under 31 inches, it's not ideal. Also, I couldn't find a recruiting grade for him, but I imagine if he got to Georgia, it had to be pretty decent. But with the lack of information and the lack of production, it's hard to gauge why he was picked up. His PFF grades aren't particularly high, and I don't really see the pedigree either. Not only did the Chargers get 2 wide receivers named Jaylen, they also got 2 wide receivers named Johnson. Though Leon Johnson doesn't share much with the other 2 guys. And he's definitely by far the most intriguing of the 3. For one, he's 6'5", and you know, I'm one of those suckers who always thinks every 6'5" guy's the next Randy Moss. But not actually, but you know what I mean. It's not unwise to take a shot on a bigger guy. And it's not just the size that's intriguing with him. He was a Division III transfer. He got to Oklahoma and didn't really get to play that much in his first year until injuries opened up a spot for him. And considering he was just a recent transfer and he was productive that quickly, it's quite impressive. And if you look at his measurables, the wingspan checks out for a tall guy, so he's not a T-Rex kind of prospect. And his 4.53 40 is very solid for a guy that size. Out of these 3 guys, he's definitely the one to keep an eye on. Next up, we have Luke Benson, a tight end out of Georgia Tech. He's just a shade under 6'4", weighs about 241 pounds, and ran a 4.43 at his pro day, though Dane Brugler has him listed as 4.52. There might have been some friendly stopwatches at the pro day, but regardless, even 4.52 is a really good speed. And he's going to have to be fast considering, according to PFF at least, his run blocking isn't up to snuff. Either way, he's an intriguing prospect because they didn't really do much with tight end in the draft. And the Greg Roman offense tends to feature tight end pretty heavily, so there could be an opportunity there for him. Zach Heins from South Dakota State, who basically sounds like Jim Harbaugh's wet dream. To quote Dane Brugler, Heins has capped potential as a pass catcher, but he offers size and competitiveness to fit as a rotational Y for a team that runs heavy 12 and 13 personnel packages. Honestly, I would be shocked if this guy doesn't have a future with the Chargers. Next up, we have the offensive line, which features arguably the best prospect they were able to pick up. Tyler McLellan isn't the best one, but he's intriguing in his own way. He's 6'7", over 300 pounds, and PFF gave him an 83 grade for his season last year playing for Campbell, which is a school I'm not too familiar with, but apparently they're the Fighting Camels. That said, his arm length is below average. He wanted to be around 34 and he's closer to 32. so that good PFF grade might not be as good in the NFL with better competition. Either way, it's smart to go after a guy who graded well at a small school and give him a shot. Next up we have Tyler Smith, and no, not that Tyler Smith. Though he's also an offensive lineman, and he's also the second UDFA the Chargers have signed named Tyler. He's listed at 6'8", but according to the Beast Guide he's closer to 6'6", but he's over 300 pounds and he played for the Western Carolina Catamounts. I'm not even halfway through, I'm definitely feeling like the scouting team, after picking mostly big name college players, are trying to go for the hipster picks for the UDFAs. Considering every pick was like from Michigan or Notre Dame or Georgia, and now we're going with the Catamounts and the Camels. And he's not quite as intriguing as McLellan. His PFF grade was a 69.1 last year, and his armor length is also below average, so without even dominating the small school competition, I'm not as excited about him personally. One prospect I am excited about is Karsen Barnhart. For one, he sounds like he's got a Viking name, and apparently his first passion was dirt biking before he switched to football. But more importantly, in the NFL, he profiles as a backup guard and a tackle in a pinch. And backing up players is something he's very comfortable with since he came in for Zach Zinter this year in their run for the championship. It's unlikely that he ever becomes a starter, but he'll be a good depth piece. And based on his demeanor and look, he's likely to be a pretty popular player with Chargers fans. Next up, we've got Willis Patrick, an offensive guard out of TCU. At 6'3" and 320 pounds-ish, he's definitely a big body. What's interesting is that he's listed at 340 in a lot of places, and apparently he's done a good job of keeping his weight down. He played in college actually for 6 years, starting at Angelo State, working his way up to Jackson State before getting to TCU. So if you couple that with the weight loss, it's a pretty interesting career arc and shows that he's willing to get better and willing to put in the work. Not to mention his arm length is where you want it to be, and PFF gave him a 73 grade overall for his last season with TCU, with an 81 specifically for his pass blocking. So I wouldn't sleep on him as a prospect. It's going to be tough for him to make the roster considering already how many guys they have under contract, but I would keep an eye out for him. Bucky Williams is a center guard prospect. He's 6'3" and 300 pounds, but his arm length is a little under what you'd like him to be for an interior offensive lineman, but not low enough at 31 3/4 to be completely disqualifying. Not to mention, his grades are pretty impressive. In his last 2 seasons for Appalachian State, he had an 81 and 84, including a 90 grade in run blocking in 2022. Again, Bucky Williams is going to have a tough time making the roster because of how crowded it is, but if he can crack it and he ends up working out at center, there's not much keeping him from a job even next year, potentially. So he's definitely one to keep an eye on. Next up, we have the defensive backs. First up is Akeem Dent, a safety out of Florida State. Coming out of high school, he was a 4-star recruit as a corner and getting comped to Brashad Breeland, but he had to move to safety. He didn't get invited to the combine, but in his pro day, he flashed some pretty intriguing numbers. With a 40-yard dash at 4.45 at 200 pounds, it's a speed that would have put him near the top for safeties this year at the combine. He's also pretty agile, and as Dane Brugler describes him, he has oily hips. He's got some potential, especially since he's not someone who's played safety all of his career. With a full-time shift into safety, you could see him blossoming potentially. As far as opportunity goes, he doesn't have much blocking on the roster, considering a guy like JT Woods is keeping him from a spot. Another safety that could benefit from JT Woods is Thomas Harper. He's a guy that some feel should have been drafted, and it's not hard to see why, considering his tape was as good as it is. And he's pretty versatile since he was kind of used as a chess piece by his coach, but mostly he played at nickel. His speed is also pretty good at 4.49. I think ultimately maybe it's because he didn't make a lot of splash plays, but regardless, I like his chances at making at least the practice squad. Next up we have another Jaylen, except this is Jaylen Phillips and he's a safety. He ran a 4.65, which at 6 foot and 200 pounds is not great, but arm length and wingspan wise, he's definitely above average. And he does have some special teams experience. Not to mention he is strong enough to cover tight ends. Overall, he's the least intriguing of the 3 safety prospects. But it's worth mentioning that along with the other 2 safeties, all 3 of them are in the top 40 of Dane Brugler's safety list. Compare that to the wide receivers they're picking up who, like Jalen Johnson for example, is ranked 239th. They're not digging as deep when it comes to safety, and they're trying to get the best guys in. Good chance that one of these guys become a prominent figure. If I had a gambling sponsorship, I definitely would be picking one of the safeties as being the most likely to make the Chargers. Next up we have cornerback Robert Kennedy. Obviously interesting name, but I'm not touching that. At 5'9" and 191 pounds, he looks like a nickel-only kind of corner. And in fact, he started every game for NC State this year at that position. He was fairly productive with an interception for a touchdown, as well as a 1.5 sacks. Also, he ran a 4.58, and his arm length is a bit below average. Nevertheless, despite the not-so-great measurables, he did get a 79.7 grade from PFF, so I can see where the Chargers are coming from on this one. Another corner is Zamari Walton from Ole Miss. He's listed a lot as 6'3", but he's closer to 6'1.5" according to Dane Brugler, but that's plenty big for a corner. He also plays a physical brand of football, and he seems like a nice addition to the depth chart, giving them another big guy to develop on the practice squad potentially. Next up, we've got the front set. Considering how many draft picks and as well as long-term signings they have tied up into this area, it's going to be hard for an undrafted free agent to make it as a linebacker or an edge or defensive tackle. First up, we have Tremon Morris-Brash at 6'2.5" and 296 pounds. He's undersized to be an edge. He doesn't have the speed to be a linebacker, but he was a rarity in college these days, which was a 5-year starter. So I think that means something to coaches. And he was pretty productive, getting 8.5 sacks in 13 games last year. He gets bonus points for being such a polite young man, and I'm basing this completely on his interaction with The Undertaker at his pro day. Next up, we have Savion Jackson. Savion Jackson's another tweener type. He's 6'2", 260 pounds. And he ran a 5.07, and his measurements aren't particularly impressive, and neither was his production really. He had 5.5 sacks in his last season. He was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school, and there was a lot of optimism about what he could kind of develop into physically, but hasn't really quite materialized yet. He's definitely a long shot to make the practice squad. Next up, we've got Micheal Mason. Profiles as a gap shooting defensive tackle. He's a little undersized, but his production, 7.5 sacks, even though it wasn't against great competition, is still pretty impressive. Even more impressive, he has a bachelor's degree in physics. So if he ever made the team, he could definitely give Justin Herbert a run for his money in terms of science knowledge on the team. And so we got Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste, a linebacker out of Ole Miss. At 6'2", 237, he's more of a thumper type, but his speed's not bad. But he's going to have a tough time making the roster, and he's at best a practice squad guy. Lastly, we have the quarterbacks. And by quarterbacks, I mean just the one guy that they got. And that's Casey Bauman. And obviously the easy joke to make here is that he's a threat to Justin Herbert. But since, according to 3 Down Nation, a CFL site, he was not regarded as an early round prospect in the CFL draft. Bauman is technically Canadian because he grew up near the border in Washington. He kind of seems like a hipster pick to me. Not really sure what in his profile tells you that he has a chance. Maybe this is some Canadian on Canadian crime since I'm one. But yeah, since he's not much of a CFL prospect, I'm pretty sure he's probably not much of an NFL one either. Thanks again for watching, and let me know who you like best from this year's crop.